welcome back to Lineup Breakdown. I'm your host, Josh Shepardson, and you can follow me on Twitter, where I post this at BChat50, and I am back to break down the big winners from Week 12 in the FanDuel Sunday Million and from the DraftKings Millionaire Maker. And first of all, congratulations to Big Neo, who won the FanDuel Sunday Million, as well as K-Easy, who won the Millionaire Maker over at DraftKings. After a low-scoring output last week for the big GPP winners, it's back to normal with bigger scores here this week. There were 4 players that were in common on both rosters. And without further ado, let's jump right into this FanDuel Sunday Millions winning roster that was headlined by Russell Wilson, who scored 35.2 fantasy points. And while he's a dual threat, did almost all of his damage through the air, passing for 5 touchdowns and 345 yards. He did add 1.4 points with his legs, rushing for 14 yards, but he really just shredded the Steelers through the air. At $7,600, you certainly got more than your money's worth there. Steelers defense really failed to show up this week in a road tilt against the Seahawks. And Russell Wilson, the second week in a row, was the quarterback on the Sunday Million winning roster. So expect Russell Wilson's ownership to steadily rise as he's playing at a high level the last few weeks. At one of the running back positions, Adrian Peterson delivered as a stud back. He bounced back from a bad showing against the Green Bay Packers the week before, rushed for 158 yards, a pair of scores, added 2 receptions for 29 yards. He's been a stud all year. He's leading the league in rushing. And as I said on the GPP podcast and in my GPP picks article for the week, I suspected Peterson would be slightly under-owned based on the value plays at running back this week, and that turned out to be the case here at FanDuel. 13.2% ownership in the Sunday Million. Certainly a number of gamers probably kicking themselves for skimping at running back with Peterson's big output this week. Next up at running back, we have Christopher Ivory, and he was 10.3% owned in the FanDuel Sunday Million, and he was a veer off of the chalkier Thomas Rawls, probably in large part because the investment in Russell Wilson and another player here coming up in the passing attack. But Ivory, more expensive than Rawls, but did deliver 17.2 fantasy points on 87 yards rushing, a touchdown, and 15 yards receiving on a pair of receptions. Certainly a decent showing, solid. Anytime you're hovering around 20 fantasy points from your cheaper back, you're doing pretty well. And that was the case for Ivory here, and a nice showing against the division rival Miami Dolphins. OBJ was the chalkiest pick on this roster, despite a big price tag of $9,100. Absolutely carved up the Redskins, the division rival Redskins, going off for 9 receptions for 142 yards and a magnificent touchdown grab. Really another highlight reel grab, which we're becoming used to with OBJ. The guy just has phenomenal hands. Made a one-handed grab diving into the end zone this week, and really delivered, scoring a nice fantasy output this week. But the real big hit on this roster, and I mean, there were a few, got some big outputs from some of their players, but Doug Baldwin at $5,300 was a heck of a value. Just 1% owned is really the big number here, because that is not a big number. 1% certainly slipped through the cracks, really carved up a secondary that lacks corners to shut down opposing receivers. And Baldwin, well, he's the leading receiver for the Seahawks, really had put in some ho-hum lines throughout the year. Looked more like a receiver who was pressed into number 1 duty and really not a number 1 receiver. But this week he played like a number 1. Half of his grabs, he had 6 of them, resulted in touchdowns, and he ripped off 145 yards receiving. He just looked like a man amongst boys out there, absolutely embarrassing the Pittsburgh Steelers this week, and with 35.5 fantasy points, led this team in scoring, and was a huge difference maker at just that 1% ownership. But another low-owned receiver also made some waves, besting 30 fantasy points this week on this winning roster, and that was Sammy Watkins, the Buffalo Bills. Another cheap-ish receiver was $1,500 more than Doug Baldwin, but a $6,800, not a bad price point against the Kansas City Chiefs team that entered the week allowing the most fantasy points to wide receivers in FanDuel and DraftKings games. 1.8% owned, coming off of a disappointing showing against the New England Patriots and a poor game on Revis Island the week before that. And at under 2% ownership, I mean, his 6 for 158 and 2 touchdown line was a huge difference maker. Like Baldwin, that's 65 plus points from 2 players who both were fairly cheap. Both were super low owned. I mean, you combine their ownership rate and you'd be happy with the 2.8% ownership rate from a player who goes off, and that's their ownership rate combined. So, I mean, that kind of puts into perspective how great of diamonds in the rough these two were. At tight end, not a diamond in the rough, an actual fairly popular play this week was Jordan Reed, just $5,800 and facing a Giants team that has struggled to defend tight ends, giving up big fantasy scoring outputs all year. Reed delivered a solid line despite failing to reach the end zone. 8 grabs for 98 yards, certainly not bad, especially not at a $5,800 salary at tight end. Good showing for Reed, kept this team top the standings. Certainly nothing to knock this team off its top perch. Ditto for Blair Walsh, who failed to reach double digits in fantasy points, but 8 points, not a total dud, and again, not enough to derail this team from winning the FanDuel Sunday Million. Finally, the team was rounded out by a value defense, a $4,400 Minnesota Vikings defense, just 1.1% owned, and there were a number of value defenses that were getting some love this week. The Vikings, not one of them, but they turned in a great showing. Even though they gave up over 100 yards to Tevin Coleman with Devontae Freeman out, still turned in a nice game, kept Matty Ice in check, and ultimately forced 3 turnovers, 2 picks, 1 fumble that they recovered, added 2 sacks, and held them to just 10 points. And the result was double-digit fantasy points on their part and a nice showing. And anytime you're getting double-digit fantasy points from your defense, you're doing pretty good, especially when it's a value defense like the Vikings was this past week. Moving on to the DraftKings Millionaire Maker winning roster, K-Easy also had Russell Wilson, and thanks to the scoring at DraftKings, got a little bit more fantasy points from Russell Wilson as a result of the 300-yard passing bonus. Don't really need to go more in depth on Wilson. It was a great value play at just $6,000. And with the other value quarterbacks, Brian Hoyer and Josh McCown, not really turning in big games, and Wilson being a monster at just a 3.3% ownership rate, this was a huge difference maker right off the bat. Another carryover from the other big winner this week, the FanDuel Sunday Millions roster, is Adrian Peterson, who was higher owned in the DraftKings Millionaire Maker, 23.6 ownership rate. $7,300 was a much more cap-friendly salary than at FanDuel, and DraftKings gamers certainly took note. Got to imagine the flex probably impacted that ownership rate as well, but at under a quarter of rosters owning Adrian Peterson in the DraftKings Millionaire Maker was actually slightly under-owned, considering he was facing a bad Falcons defense, and at least from allowing fantasy points to running backs this year, that perspective. And with Peterson leading the league in rushing, it really shouldn't be a shocker to anyone to see that he went off this week. And I think there are a number of gamers probably kicking themselves in hindsight for not using Peterson. I suspected his ownership rate was going to be a little lower than it should be this week, but it still hovered around 25%. And those that did roster him certainly got a nice showing and have to be patting themselves on the back. One of the chalk plays at running back this week was Thomas Rawls. That he made this roster, just $4,500 against the Pittsburgh Steelers, 28.4% ownership. Didn't have a big showing. Did not follow up his monster Week 11 showing with a big output, but 14.1 fantasy points at $4,500 is not bad. You take that from your RB2, or for those that used him in their flex spot, $4,500, 14.1 points is not bad. 81 yards rushing, a touchdown, certainly good enough at that price point. Another carryover and stack partner of Russell Wilson was Doug Baldwin, and the cafe value hit the nail on the head. If you read the Friday article examining cafe value, you saw that he was a top 5 value at the wide receiver position at DraftKings, checked in second. Even our projections were short on him, but certainly the projections here at Daily Fantasy Cafe liked the matchup with the Steelers' soft secondary, liked the volume of work that Baldwin had been getting, and he slipped through the cracks, and at just 2.7% ownership was a big difference maker. And like Russell Wilson and Adrian Peterson, scored a little bit more on DraftKings thanks to the yardage bonus as he bested 100 yards receiving. The final carryover from the other roster, making it 4 common players on both of the big winning rosters this week, was Odell Beckham Jr., and he was 39.2% owned, $8,700. Fading the chalk, DeAndre Hopkins certainly paid off for K-Easy here with Odell Beckham turning in a big showing, and again made a great diving one-handed catch, bested the 100 yards receiving, so he got the yardage bonus, and delivered in a big way on being one of the chalk plays here this past week, I should say. A non-chalk play was Jarvis Landry, OBJ's former LSU teammate, fellow second-year receiver, was just 2.5% owned against the Jets, who were without Darrelle Revis, was just $6,600, and he was a garbage time hero, piling up numbers late in the game, finished the contest with 13 receptions for 165 yards and a touchdown on 16 targets. And when you get that kind of showing from a guy at just 2.5% ownership, that is a monster showing. Actually, came just a few points short of Doug Baldwin, but between the two, scored over 80 fantasy points at 5.2% ownership combined for the duo. So that is a hell of a combination at wide receiver, and K-Easy hit big on their contrarian plays this week. Moving out of tight end, another contrarian play, 4.4% owned Julius Thomas, $3,400, had a good matchup with the Chargers, and he finally played like the dynamic playmaker that this offense has been looking for, that they thought they were getting when they signed him to a big free agent contract in the offseason. The wait was worth it, at least in the eyes of K-Easy, I'm sure. Caught 9 balls, including 1 touchdown for 116 yards receiving. So you got the touchdown, you got the yardage bonus, and you got 9 points for receptions with the full point PPR scoring at DraftKings. At sub 5% ownership, that's a big hit, especially when he outperformed the chalk like Delaney Walker and Jordan Reed this week. Next up's another non-chalk pick, and that's Amari Cooper, 5.1% ownership, $6,800. Coming off of a nightmare showing with 1 grab for 4 receptions in Week 11. K-Easy kept the faith in the star rookie receiver, and Cooper paid him off with 115 yards receiving on 7 grabs, and got that yardage bonus, got the nice 7 points for the receptions as well. Certainly didn't need a touchdown, didn't get a touchdown, but didn't need it with the yardage and receptions output that was there. And again, another low-owned receiver, 5.1% ownership. Expect gamers to get back on the Amari Cooper bandwagon after yet another 100-yard effort from him, his 100-plus yard effort from him, his 4th of the year. Finally, the roster was rounded out by a defense that was actually the lowest scoring player, I guess you could say, for this roster. The Chiefs are on quite the run, and a lot of that has to do with their defense stepping up in a big way. Didn't really put in a big effort against the Buffalo Bills. Didn't get any points for allowing 22 points to the Buffalo Bills, but saved some face with 2 fumble recoveries and 1 sack, ultimately totaled 5 fantasy points. That was enough to keep this team from toppling out of the top spot and push K-Easy to a big win and your latest Millionaire Maker winner. And that's going to wrap things up for this week's podcast. Check out dailyfantasycafe.com to check out all of our tools. We've got Colossus, the lineup optimizer. We've got a stack generator tool. We've got our unique cafe value. We've also got a salary exploitation tool to check out so you can see where you're getting the most bang for your buck on players across basically all of the major DFS websites that offer fantasy football. Get on that, check that out. Also, check out the podcasts like this one and our great articles. Even if you're not a fantasy football gamer, we've got content for you. We've got NBA content, college football content. We've got it all. Check it out, and hopefully next week, your roster will be the one that's featured. One of your rosters will be featured here in this lineup breakdown as a big winner. Until then, good luck.